Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the maps you studied your entire life are suddenly obsolete. The borders you thought were carved in stone have simply vanished into thin air. History is filled with tales of monumental shifts, where invincible behemoths, seemingly destined to last for eternity, crumble not from external conquest, but from the unbearable weight of their own internal contradictions. We often think of historical turning points as loud, explosive events, a sudden battle, a dramatic decree, or a swift cataclysm that reshapes the world overnight. But reality is rarely so cinematic. True systemic failure is usually a slow, quiet rot. It is the invisible rust eating away at steel beams, the unseen termites hollowing out the floorboards, and the gradual erosion of trust among the very people holding the structure together. For decades, a massive shadow stretched across half the globe, casting a long, chilling silhouette over billions of lives. It was an entity so vast, so deeply entrenched in the daily rhythm of the world, that imagining its absence was practically impossible. Politicians built their entire careers around containing it. Ordinary families lived in constant, low-level dread of its military might. The geopolitical chessboard was completely defined by this single, overwhelming presence. And yet, beneath the imposing facade of military parades and endless propaganda, the foundation was profoundly brittle. The facade projected absolute strength and unwavering unity, demanding total obedience and silencing any whispers of doubt. However, behind closed doors, a different reality was taking shape. A reality of empty shelves, whispered jokes, and a growing unspoken consensus that the system was fundamentally broken. That entity was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. And in late 1991, without a massive foreign invasion or a nuclear apocalypse, the largest country on Earth simply ceased to exist. How does a superpower, armed to the teeth with nuclear warheads and a sprawling secret police, just evaporate? To understand the fall, we have to look at the decades preceding it, a period historians call the era of stagnation. On paper, the Soviet Union was a socialist utopia. In reality, it was an economic black hole. The planned economy, dictated by bureaucrats in Moscow, was incredibly inefficient. They could build thousands of tanks and send humans into space, but they couldn't figure out how to produce enough shoes, toilet paper, or bread for their own citizens. A massive portion of the state's budget was poured into the military-industrial complex to keep up with the West during the Cold War. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens spent hours of their lives waiting in queues for basic necessities. The gap between the glorious propaganda on state television and the grim reality of everyday life created a society built on cynicism. Everyone knew the system was failing, and everyone knew that the government knew it was failing. But no one was allowed to say it out loud. Then came 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. What was supposed to be a quick intervention turned into a grueling, decade-long quagmire. It was the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Thousands of young men returned home in zinc coffins, draining not just the state treasury, but the morale of the entire nation. By 1985, the Soviet leadership was dying off, literally. In a span of just 3 years, 3 elderly Soviet leaders died in office. The system finally realized it needed young blood. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev knew the economy was on life support. To fix it, he introduced 2 revolutionary policies that would ultimately seal the empire's fate: perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Perestroika was an attempt to inject a little bit of free market energy into the rigid communist economy. Glasnost was even more dangerous. It allowed for freedom of speech. For the first time in decades, the media could criticize the government. People could read previously banned books. The dark history of Stalin's purges was brought to light. Gorbachev hoped that by giving people a voice, he could reform the system. Instead, he opened a Pandora's box. Once people were allowed to speak, they didn't ask for a better version of communism. They asked to burn the whole thing down. But the true point of no return happened on April 26, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. When reactor number 4 exploded, releasing a massive radioactive cloud, the Soviet government did what it always did. It lied. They tried to cover it up, even as radiation drifted across Europe. It was only when the world demanded answers that Moscow admitted the truth. For the Soviet citizens, Chernobyl wasn't just an ecological tragedy, it was the ultimate metaphor for the Soviet state itself. A toxic, outdated machine held together by lies, failing catastrophically at the expense of human lives. By 1989, the fear was gone. The nations of Eastern Europe, long held under the Soviet thumb, began to rise up. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. One by one, they threw off their communist governments. In the past, Moscow would have sent tanks to crush these rebellions. But Gorbachev refused to intervene. The fever of independence quickly spread into the Soviet Union itself. The USSR was made up of 15 republics, and nationalism was boiling over. In August 1989, 2 million people across the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined hands to form a human chain spanning 400 miles, demanding independence. It was a peaceful, beautiful, and devastating blow to Moscow's authority. The republics realized that if they pushed, the center would not hold. In August 1991, hardline communists orchestrated a desperate coup. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest and rolled tanks into Moscow, trying to seize control and turn back the clock. But they were too late. The people refused to comply. Tens of thousands of Muscovites poured into the streets, standing in front of the tanks. The military refused to fire on their own people. The coup collapsed in just 3 days. This was the fatal blow. The central authority was humiliated and paralyzed. In the months that followed, republic after republic declared independence. Ukraine's overwhelming vote for independence in December 1991 was the final nail in the coffin. Without Ukraine, a union was functionally impossible. On the evening of December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat in front of a television camera and resigned as the president of a country that no longer existed. Quietly, without fanfare, the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the very last time. A superpower that had defeated Nazi Germany, launched the first human into space, and terrified the world for decades, didn't end with a bang. It ended with a signature on a piece of paper and a flag coming down in the cold winter night. History teaches us that no empire is truly immortal. The bigger the facade, the harder the fall. What do you think was the single biggest reason for the Soviet collapse? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed this dive into history, hit that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.